So Jack and I had, to steal a comic book term, Jack and I had very similar origin stories. I think one of the reasons that we connected so quickly is, in the 1930s, Jack saw Rasmus Nielsen at the sideshow, swinging anvils, which I've been told were not maybe full weight. Maybe they were hollowed out, but swinging.
As someone who went to the gym right before we were recording, they were probably fake. I'm
going to say they were definitely fake. They were really heavy. They just weren't really heavy. Jack saw him swinging weights off his piercings, absolutely became fascinated. And in the 1950s, I think he saw an article about a student at a rival college who had pierced his ear, or very culturally insensitive, had his ears pierced by the gypsies when he was doing his summer abroad or whatever. And Jack was like, well, we can't let this guy in this college get all this attention. So he convinced some of his fellows, and it was been mid-1950s, to pierce their ears, kind of caused the... Jack was born in Ohio, so it was probably someplace around there. He didn't move to D.C. until later. And, there was this group of male college students in the 1950s who had pierced ears, and he had never really stopped thinking about Rasmus. I don't think he knew his name at the time. He did later find out who Rasmus was, but decided to use a darning needle to pierce his nipples. And I'm sure some of his fellows saw that in the context that he was hiding from his family, and he started piercing their nipples, and that led him to discover other things that you could pierce. So he started kind of piercing underground in the 50s and didn't start really doing it as a career until the 1980s when he retired. His wife had passed away. He didn't have to live under the constraints of, pretending to be, not to pretend. He loved his wife. I mean, as a gay man myself who's married to a woman who I absolutely adore, another thing that Jack and I had in common. I mean, even when his wife passed, he had her wedding ring turned into his earring, so she would always be with him. He wasn't. I think in conversations I had, keep in mind that I was 15 when I met him, that there was a lot of abstracts in the way we would discuss. But I think that his wife knew that he was gay, and it was one of those things like, Till, you keep that stuff over here.
This is something that comes up a lot. Like I've got a student at the moment working on a PhD about the Beaumont Society, who are they're kind of very problematic in lots of ways organization in Britain for trans women largely, but their whole thing, you had to sign a thing to join the Body Society saying you were definitely a very straight guy who just liked wearing dresses, and you weren't gay at all. And of course it's a defense mechanism as much as a kind of conceptual barrier. But I think, people didn't have the conceptual language or the political space to have these serious conversations about how difficult and interesting sexuality and gender and life is, right? Because they just weren't able to have those conversations, at least not openly.
It fascinates me that anyone having met Jack for more than a minute could think he was heterosexual. I remember my mom, who clocked me as gay when I was probably 8. She's like, well, is he though? And I'm like, Mom, there's a giant picture of a man with a boner in his living room. There's he's got naked dudes tattooed all over him. And it's like, yeah, but my mom also thought Liberace was just an act. So the gaydar wasn't great. So Jack, originally it was mostly just piercings. In the 80s, he started splitting his genitals and getting into the more surgical stuff that he became known for. But he was just a lovely, pleasant guy. Loved writing, letters back in the day. He was a correspondent of pretty much everyone that we look up to. He would send letters to Sebastian. He would visit Alan when they'd travel and all that. And he was this perfectly lovely man who, I don't know. Given the overt sexuality of the stuff that he was into, I remember when I was younger, the younger piercing kids thought it was so cool that I spent my mid-teens at this weird piercing place. And then as cultural norms have changed, now it's red flaggy that I was over at this old man's house where everybody was naked and, taking pictures of each other, but it was so banal.
Yeah.
Everyone's naked. Yeah, this guy's just getting his guiche pierced, but they're talking about collecting classic cars and what their favorite ice cream flavors are. There was never anything where I had to pause and be like, should I be here? Other than the obvious that, I was a kid getting, tattooed, pierced, whatever. But I mean, you hate to use this as a defense. It was a different time.
Yeah. We had, this is maybe an interesting segue, or a segue of some kind at least, into like BME, because I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about just being on the internet really early, like being on Usenet and rec.arts.body art, which is, I know you were involved with as well. Like I was 15 as well when I got on there. I got a modem for my 15th birthday. And, we used to go to meetups when we were like 16, 17, and they were like 16, 17 years old. I don't think there weren't any like kids there, but there were definitely 15-year-olds there. And there were like people in their 50s and older. And it was a weird moment in time that it was just loads of weirdos who'd found a way to talk to each other. Like there were definitely, I'm sure, look, I'm not going to sanitize it. There were definitely some fucking horrible people in every community, but like a lot of my experience is the same as yours, Shawn. And I know lots of people I've spoken to, even not in the sexual bit, just the kind of being on the internet bit of it. It was just this very weird moment in time all of a sudden where it was easier to meet people who were into things you were into, and it sort of initially didn't really matter that some people were in their 20s and some people were in their 50s, Yeah,
I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about the books, like you had to be looking for it to find it. And I think that, now I'll go out shopping and you'll see 17, 18-year-old kid with facial tattoos and all that. I obviously worry about them in a concern trolling kind of way, but there's no, your buddy can get a tattoo machine off Amazon. Mm-hmm. Every city has at least one really good tattooer, but let's be honest, they probably have a handful that you've never even heard of who you see their work and it blows you away. Back then, you had to search it out. You had to find it. And I remember I grew up in a farm town. When I started getting visibly heavily tattooed, I had my own security detail. As soon as I'd walk into Walmart or the grocery store, I had a security guard assigned to me to follow me, and I go back 20 years later and the security guards have tattoos on their neck.
But this is also, I find it so funny because one, it's that kind of idea that over time, eventually, all extremities become the norm. But it's also when the area I live in London, when I get the tube to the place where I work in the studio, inevitably, I'd say about 50% of the time on the tube, I'm getting stared at by at least 4 or 5 older people. And I have as Matt says, I have tough guy tattoos. So I just have like some nasty shit. And it's just like, it's weird that 30 years later, those things haven't changed, and it's probably people who are the same age as my parents or like around kind of your age and like would have been exposed to that sort of stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it's still so wild to them.
Well, realistically, I'm probably the age of your parents, so let's just
I'm also plausibly the age of your parents, Tom, so
I mean you're like 4 years older than my brother, Matt.
No,
you're Irish.
Second marriage baby, what can I say?
Yeah, it was, and I'm sure you could have a punk podcast or you could have whatever, and there's these old guys that are like, it was such a special time. It was just such a special time, man. It was so rad. New stuff was coming so quickly. I mean, I obviously I love Higgs to this day, but Guy Aitchison, man. Yeah. The first time I saw him.
We are going to interview him on the podcast because,
Guy's amazing. I don't know how comfortable he would be with me telling this story, but I used to correspond with him because I was this weird kid who sent letters to everyone, and I was like, "Hey, man, when I turn 18, can I get tattooed?" And he's like, "Well, I tattoo in Chicago where I tattoo 21-year-olds because it's illegal to tattoo anyone under 21, and I tattoo 18-year-olds. So kind of when you can get tattooed by me, you can get tattooed by me, if you know what I'm saying." And he said, we were back and forthing, and he's like, "Hey, I'm going to be tattooing in Florida at the shop for Bike Week. Would you go up and make sure I'm not getting in over my head? It's bikers, it's whatever." And, I went up to that shop. I was 16 at the time, just to kind of check it out to make sure that, he doesn't come into the shop and they have a huge swastika flag behind them and, tattooing in the South in 90, 91, 92. And, the first person I meet there was a guy named John Himmelstein, who John just did that really cool Leather Daddy drawing for us for Sacred. I'm so, 30 years later, still friendly with him. They turn out they're like really good shop that's trying to they're a very biker shop, but they're trying to, get younger people in. A couple months later, I go up to get tattooed by a guy. I think I'm like 17 by this point. And the apprentice at the shop was Mike Wilson, not even tattooing yet. And it was just like I had an appointment middle of the day, and guy was like, "Hey man, you want to get tattooed later? Like, hang around all day, just kind of watch how this plays out." Bikers were coming up with just cash rolls, like, "You do me a wizard," And it was just he was a couple of years older than me at the time, but he was still a kid, And it was just we read that generation. We read the same comic books, we watched the same movies, we spoke the same language, and it was like, think about what was big in 92, and then guy comes along and it's H.R. Giger and End of the World. And it was so different than anything we had seen, and everything seemed so cool. And I see so many beautiful tattoos now, but nothing that I've seen in the last 10 years has been, this is going to change the way everything progresses, and back then that was Eddie Deutsch doing graffiti, that was Guy doing biomech, that was Higgs taking the traditional footprint and just getting weird with it in ways that Hardy had done, obviously, but as like weird one-offs, whereas Dan lived being this weird, at the same shop with Corbin, who's doing these beautiful black and gray. Like nothing to me these days seems like it's going to be the thing that changes everything, but